The house stood quietly at the edge of a small coastal town, a few miles from the restless sea. It wasn't luxurious or new, just a modest, two-story home painted in fading white, surrounded by wild rose bushes that Sarah had planted years ago. On warm evenings, the scent of salt and flowers drifted through the open windows, filling the air with a sense of peace that Michael once thought would last forever. Every corner of the house carried their history. The small oak table in the kitchen still bore the marks of the first dinner they'd shared as a married couple. The dent on the hallway wall reminded Michael of the day they tried to move a too-large wardrobe upstairs and laughed until they cried. The fireplace, with its slightly crooked stones, had seen countless quiet nights where they sat wrapped in a blanket, sharing silence that once felt like understanding. Outside, the ocean murmured beyond the dunes, a constant reminder of both freedom and distance. Michael often watched it from the veranda after work, his cup of coffee slowly cooling in his hands. He had once believed that peace could be built like a house, brick by brick, promise by promise. But peace, as he learned too late, was fragile, and love could fracture without a sound. At night, the shadows inside the house grew long and familiar. He would lie awake beside Sarah, listening to her soft breathing, wondering if she dreamed of him or someone else. The walls, once warm with laughter, began to feel like witnesses, silent but not blind. In those quiet hours, before everything fell apart, Michael could not yet see how deeply the cracks had formed beneath the surface. He thought love was strong enough to endure unspoken words and half-truths. He didn't know that the same home that sheltered them would one day become a tomb for their trust. The seaside wind howled through the trees, rattling the window panes. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled across the horizon, as if warning him of the storm that was about to come. But Michael, lost in his familiar routine, simply turned on the porch light, unaware that by this time tomorrow, it would illuminate something he could never unsee. Michael Turner was the kind of man people trusted instantly. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight, calm, measured, thoughtful. At 38, he had built a quiet life of order and simplicity. He worked as a mechanical engineer for a shipping company in town, fixing things that were broken, restoring function to what had failed. That was his gift, to mend. But what he could never predict was that one day, the thing most precious to him, his marriage, would break in a way no tool could ever repair. Sarah, his wife of 10 years, had once been the light in every corner of his world. She had an easy laugh and eyes that seemed to catch sunlight even on gray days. In the early years, their connection had been effortless. Dinners full of conversation, weekend trips, shared dreams of children and travel. But time, Michael later realized, has a quiet way of changing people. It doesn't always shout or warn. Sometimes it just shifts the air between two hearts until the silence becomes too heavy to ignore. Sarah had recently started working at a marketing firm in the city. The job demanded long hours, late meetings, and frequent business trips. She seemed proud of her new position, and Michael, supportive as always, encouraged her. He told himself that her late returns, her distracted glances, and her growing attachment to her phone were simply signs of stress. He never wanted to be the kind of husband who doubted without reason. And then there was John Whitmore. John was Sarah's colleague, a man Michael had met twice, once at an office party and once when he came by to drop Sarah off after work. He was everything Michael wasn't: confident, charming, and effortlessly social. The kind of man who filled a room with his presence. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his eyes, sharp and observant, seemed to linger a little too long on Sarah. Michael had noticed, but told himself not to be paranoid. He remembered Sarah's words when he asked about John after the party. "John's harmless," she'd said, with a laugh that felt just a bit forced. "He's just that way with everyone." Michael nodded, forcing a smile. But something inside him, small and uneasy, refused to settle. In the weeks that followed, life carried on as usual, but there was a subtle shift. Sarah's phone buzzed more often. She turned it face down when it rang. Her laughter, once shared freely with Michael, now came from behind closed doors when she was on the phone. When he asked who it was, she would smile and say, "Just work, Michael. You know how demanding clients are." He did know. And yet, each time she said it, the words seemed to lose a little more truth. Still, he loved her. Deeply, quietly, stubbornly. So he convinced himself that love meant trust, even when it hurt to give it. He didn't notice how the space between them had grown until one night. As they sat together watching a movie, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up, her thumb trembling slightly. A message flashed for only a second before she turned the screen away, but Michael caught enough to see the first word of the sender's name. John. That night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep, Michael sat in the dark, staring at the faint blue light from her charging phone. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The truth, he feared, was already waiting, patient, silent, inevitable. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, steady and cold. In the reflection of the glass, Michael saw himself, tired eyes, clenched jaw, the faint trace of a man who no longer recognized his own life. Something inside him whispered that everything was about to change. He just didn't know how much. The days that followed felt heavier than usual. Nothing obvious had changed in the Turner household, yet Michael could feel something shifting beneath the surface, like the ground before an earthquake. The silence between him and Sarah was no longer peaceful. It was tense, filled with words neither of them dared to say aloud. At breakfast, Sarah scrolled through her phone while sipping coffee, smiling faintly at messages she never explained. Michael sat across from her, pretending to read the newspaper. The rustling of the pages became his shield, a way to hide the tremor in his hands. Busy day ahead? He asked casually. Always, she replied, not looking up. We're working on a big campaign. It's been insane. Her tone was normal, almost cheerful, but her eyes avoided his. Michael nodded, forcing a small smile. He knew better than to press. That evening, Sarah said she'd be home late. Another meeting, another client dinner. Michael didn't argue. He just watched as she stood in front of the mirror, applying lipstick, the reflection of her delicate hands trembling ever so slightly. She caught his gaze in the mirror and smiled. Don't wait up, she said lightly. But he waited anyway. Hours later, when she still hadn't returned, Michael walked outside. The town was quiet, the streets glistening after a light rain. He could see their car missing from the driveway, the empty space glowing pale under the streetlight. He leaned against the railing of the porch, listening to the distant crash of waves, and felt a hollow ache deep in his chest, the kind that comes from knowing you're losing something but can't yet prove it. When Sarah finally came home, the clock showed past midnight. Her perfume was stronger than usual, a fragrance he didn't recognize, floral, expensive, new. She smiled softly, kissed him on the cheek, and whispered, "You're still awake?" "I couldn't sleep," he said. She nodded, murmuring something about a long dinner, then disappeared into the bathroom. The sound of running water followed, and Michael stood in the hallway, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the darkened window. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to. But the image of the message, John, kept flashing in his mind like a warning light he couldn't turn off. The next day, he called her office to ask what time she'd finished her meeting. Her co-worker, a friendly woman named Emily, hesitated for a moment. Sarah left around 7, she said. I think she mentioned going home early. Michael thanked her, pretending not to notice the way his heart began to pound. That evening, when Sarah came home, he asked casually, "Did your meeting go well?" She smiled. Exhausting, but productive. He stared at her, and for a brief moment, she seemed to sense that he knew. Her smile faltered, only for a heartbeat, then returned, steady and practiced. It was a tiny moment, but enough. The kind that burns into memory. Over the next few weeks, Michael watched the pattern repeat. Late nights, vague explanations, nervous laughter. The distance between them grew into something physical, tangible. Even when she sat beside him on the couch, he could feel her absence, like a ghost haunting a living body. One night, as they lay in bed, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She turned over quickly, pressing it against her chest before the screen lit up. Michael closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. Her fingers moved across the screen in silence, typing, erasing, typing again. A faint smile curved her lips before she finally put the phone away and turned off the lamp. Michael lay still in the dark, his pulse steady but cold. The truth no longer hid in the shadows. It lived beside him, breathing the same air, sharing the same bed. Outside, the ocean roared louder that night. Waves crashed against the rocks with relentless force, as if echoing the turmoil inside him. He stared at the ceiling until morning, wondering if love always dies this quietly, not with shouting or betrayal caught in the act, but with soft lies and unanswered questions whispered into the dark. Michael had always believed that trust was sacred, something you built with time, with small gestures and quiet loyalty. But once cracks appear, even the smallest ones, trust begins to bleed away. It doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes, slowly, painfully, like water carving through stone. He tried to ignore the signs at first, tried to silence that voice inside him that whispered something's wrong. But silence had become unbearable. Every time Sarah left the house, every time her phone vibrated, every time she smiled at a message she didn't explain, it felt like a new fracture inside him. So one evening, he decided to know. Not guess, not assume, no. When Sarah left for another meeting, Michael followed. He waited until her car disappeared at the end of the street, then got into his own and trailed her at a distance. The city lights blurred through the windshield as he drove, neon reflections gliding across the wet asphalt. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sarah's car stopped in front of a restaurant on the edge of town, a quiet, dimly lit place known for its privacy. Michael parked 2 blocks away and walked toward the entrance, his heart pounding against his ribs. Through the glass, he saw her. She was sitting at a corner table. With him, John. The same confident smile, the same watchful eyes. Sarah leaned forward, laughing softly at something John said, her hand brushing against his. It wasn't a casual touch. It was tender, familiar. Michael froze, watching from the shadows of the street. Time seemed to stretch and twist, soundless except for the rhythmic thudding of his own heartbeat. For a long moment, he wanted to believe there was an explanation. Maybe work, maybe friendship, maybe anything but what it looked like. But then John reached across the table and gently touched Sarah's cheek. And she didn't pull away. That single gesture was enough. Something inside Michael broke, cleanly, quietly, like glass under pressure. He turned away, walked back to his car, and sat in the dark for what felt like hours. His mind refused to form thoughts. It was a storm of disbelief and grief. The woman he had built his life around, the one he trusted completely, had crossed a line she could never uncross. When Sarah came home later that night, she acted as if nothing had happened. Her hair still smelled faintly of the perfume she wore when she wanted to feel beautiful. "You're still awake?" she asked softly. Michael looked at her for a long time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Couldn't sleep." She smiled, that same easy, practiced smile, and disappeared into the bedroom. He heard the faint sound of running water in the shower, then silence. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-finished cup of coffee from earlier that evening. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, tired, hollow, unfamiliar. The next day, he decided to test one last thing. A final, desperate attempt to prove himself wrong. When Sarah left her phone on the counter before heading upstairs, Michael picked it up. His hands trembled. He didn't want to do this. It felt like a violation of something sacred, but truth demanded sacrifice. He unlocked the screen. The first message thread at the top of the list was with John. He opened it. The messages were brief, coded, intimate. "Dinner was perfect. I can't stop thinking about last night. He doesn't suspect anything. Soon." Michael stared at the words until they blurred. He didn't scroll further. He didn't need to. The betrayal was written clearly enough. When Sarah came downstairs, she saw the phone in his hand, the open screen, the frozen messages. For a moment, she didn't move. Her face went pale. Then she said quietly, "Michael, it's not what you think." He laughed, not cruelly, but brokenly. "That's what they always say." She reached for him, but he stepped back. "Don't," he said, his voice shaking. "Just don't." The space between them filled with everything unsaid. The love that once held them together now collapsing under the weight of lies. That night, Michael packed a bag. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply left. As he drove away, the streetlights stretched out in the rearview mirror like fading memories. The house grew smaller until it disappeared into the darkness, along with the life he thought was real. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of pain, yet never quite erasing it. For Michael, the years after he left Sarah were defined not by moments, but by absence. The empty space in the bed, the quiet house, the meals cooked for one. Life didn't stop, it simply changed its rhythm. Slower, colder, quieter. He rented a small cottage on the outskirts of another coastal town, far enough that no one knew his story. The ocean was still close. He couldn't bear to live too far from it, but now it felt different. Before, its sound had been comforting. Now it was a reminder of how easily things could shift, how calm could turn to chaos without warning. He worked long hours, fixing engines and machinery for the harbor's repair yard. The physical labor helped him forget, at least during the day. His hands were always busy, his mind occupied by the rhythmic grind of metal and the smell of oil. But at night, when the world went still, memories crept in like the tide. Sometimes he'd dream of Sarah, not of the betrayal itself, but of the small things, her laughter while cooking, the way she brushed her hair behind her ear, the sound of her footsteps in the morning. In dreams, she was still his wife, still smiling, still his. And every time he woke, the pain was fresh again. He didn't date. Friends suggested it. Of course, kind-hearted people trying to help him move on. But he couldn't bring himself to trust again. The word love felt foreign, fragile, like something meant for others. He had built walls so high around his heart that even he couldn't see over them. Years passed this way, quietly, predictably. He became known in town as a polite but distant man, the kind who always helped when asked but never stayed to talk. He had routines that bordered on ritual: morning coffee by the window, long walks by the sea, reading before bed. His life was small but stable, empty but safe. He told himself that was enough. One autumn evening, while the wind howled through the cracks of his old windows, Michael found an old box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were fragments of another life. A photo of him and Sarah on their wedding day, a seashell they'd picked up on their honeymoon, a note in her handwriting that read, "Forever yours." He stared at it for a long time. The words, once a promise, now felt like a ghost. He wanted to hate her, to burn the memories and bury them under years of distance. But the truth was more complicated. Hate requires energy, and Michael had long since run out of that. What remained was something quieter, resignation, perhaps, or a kind of hollow forgiveness that comes when anger has nowhere left to go. That night, he sat outside under the stars, listening to the waves crashing in the dark. The air smelled of salt and rain. He whispered into the wind, almost without meaning to, "I hope you're happy, Sarah." His voice sounded strange to him, softer, older. He didn't expect an answer. And for many years, there wasn't one. But life, in its cruel symmetry, has a way of reopening doors we thought were sealed forever. It happened on an ordinary evening, years later. Michael had just returned from work, tired, his hands stained with grease. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when someone knocked on his door. A firm, unfamiliar knock, 3 short taps. He froze. He rarely had visitors. The knock came again. He opened the door. Standing there, framed by the fading light of dusk, was a man he hadn't seen in almost a decade. Older now, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes hollow yet piercing. John. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years seemed to hang in the air between them like smoke. Heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Finally, John said quietly, "We need to talk, Michael. It's about Sarah." The mug slipped from Michael's hand and shattered against the floor. The world he had built so carefully, all those years of silence and routine, trembled. And with that knock on his door, the past came flooding back. For a long moment, Michael just stood there, frozen, staring at the man who had haunted his nightmares for almost a decade. John Whitmore, the man who had destroyed his marriage, the man whose name had become synonymous with betrayal, lies, and sleepless nights. Now he was standing on Michael's porch as if no time had passed at all. Older, thinner, his face lined with years of something that looked almost like guilt. "Can I come in?" John asked quietly. His voice was rough, uncertain, not the confident tone Michael remembered. Michael's first instinct was to slam the door shut. But something in John's eyes stopped him. They weren't the eyes of a man who came to gloat or justify himself. They were the eyes of someone burdened, haunted, desperate to be heard. Michael stepped aside. "5 minutes," he said coldly. John nodded once, stepped inside, and stood near the window. His clothes were neat but worn, his posture stiff, like someone holding the weight of an invisible truth. Michael poured himself a cup of coffee, though his hands trembled as he did. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick, almost tangible. Finally, John broke the silence. I know I'm the last person you ever wanted to see, he began. But I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. You deserve to know what really happened with Sarah. Michael let out a bitter laugh. Really happened? I think I saw enough to know the truth. John shook his head slowly. No, you didn't. What you saw was never what it looked like. Michael stared at him, jaw tightening. Don't insult me, John. I was there. I saw the messages. I saw the way she looked at you. I know, John said quietly. And I wish to God you hadn't. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with where to begin. Sarah and I never had an affair, he said at last. Everything you saw, the meetings, the texts, the late nights, it was all part of something else. Something she did to protect her brother. Michael's brow furrowed. Protect him? From what? John took a deep breath. From people who were dangerous. Her brother, Tom, had gotten involved with the wrong crowd. He borrowed money from men you don't cross, real criminals. They were threatening him, his wife, even Sarah. She was terrified, but she couldn't go to the police. Those men had connections everywhere. So she came to me for help. Michael stared, silent. John continued, his voice low, steady. I used to work in private security before the firm. I knew people who could handle situations like that, discreetly. But to get close to the men threatening Tom, we needed a cover story. They already knew Sarah was married, and that her husband was protective. We had to make them believe she was no longer under your protection, that you'd split up, that she'd moved on with someone else. That's where I came in. Michael's mind spun. The restaurant, the hotel, the messages, the whispers. All of it suddenly looked different. The same scenes, but now cast in a new light. You're saying, Michael began slowly, that all of that, the affair, was fake? John nodded. Every bit of it. She hated it, Michael. She cried after every meeting. But she knew those men were watching her. They needed to believe the story. So she played her part. Too well. Maybe. And you saw what you were never meant to see. Michael felt his throat tighten. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his mind reeling. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she just say something? John's expression darkened. Because if you knew, you'd have been in danger too. Those men were ruthless. She didn't want you anywhere near it. He hesitated, then added softly. And she thought it would be over fast. But it wasn't. It got worse. She managed to save her brother, but the cost was high. Michael stopped pacing. What do you mean? John looked at him with tired eyes. Sarah got sick, Michael. Not long after everything ended. It was cancer. Aggressive. She tried to reach you, but she didn't know where you'd gone. I was with her near the end. The words landed like stones. Michael's chest felt hollow. He sat down slowly, unable to speak. The room seemed to tilt. Memories, regrets, questions crashing together like waves. She wanted you to have this, John said quietly, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a sealed envelope, slightly crumpled with age. On the front, in delicate handwriting, was Michael's name. For a moment, Michael couldn't move. His hands shook as he took it. The familiar handwriting hit him like a blow, gentle, yet unbearable. John stood to leave. I know this doesn't make up for what happened, but she never betrayed you, Michael. She saved her family, and in her own way, she tried to save you too. He walked toward the door, paused, and added, for what it's worth, she loved you until her last breath. The door closed softly behind him. Michael sat alone, staring at the envelope. The world outside had gone dark, rain tapping against the windows. He didn't open it yet. He just held it, the fragile, final piece of a truth he had spent years hating. And for the first time in nearly a decade, he began to cry. Not out of anger, not even out of grief, but out of the unbearable realization that love, even when it hides behind lies, never truly disappears. The rain did not stop that night. It whispered against the windows, soft and endless, like the quiet sorrow of time itself. Michael sat at the old kitchen table, the same one where he and Sarah had once shared dinners, laughter, arguments, and apologies, and placed the envelope before him. It was pale yellow, the ink slightly faded, and her handwriting curved with the same grace he remembered from shopping lists, birthday cards, and love notes left on his desk years ago. For a long time, he couldn't open it. His fingers hovered above the seal, trembling. He was afraid, not of what the letter would say, but of what it would make him feel. Because he had built his entire life after the betrayal around anger. It was his armor, his excuse, his way of surviving. And if that anger was based on a lie, Then what had all those years of pain been for? But at last, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. The faint scent of lavender drifted up, the perfume she always wore. His heart clenched. He began to read. My dear Michael, if you are reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to tell you in person. And I am so sorry for that. You have every right to hate me for what you saw, for what I made you believe. But please, before you turn away, let me tell you the truth. It was never real. John and I, there was never anything between us. I swear that to you with all that I am. Everything you saw was part of a terrible, necessary lie. My brother, Tom, made mistakes, foolish, desperate ones. He got involved with dangerous people who threatened him, his wife, and even us. I couldn't let them hurt him. When John offered to help, the only way to do it safely was to make those men believe you and I were over. I had to play the part of a woman who had fallen for someone else. It broke me, Michael. Every moment of it. Each time I saw the pain in your eyes, I wanted to scream the truth. But the more you suspected, the more convincing the act had to be. I told myself it was only for a few days. Then weeks passed. Then months. And then you left. When I found out you were gone, I told myself it was better this way, that at least you were safe. But it never stopped hurting. I carried the weight of your absence every day. The silence of our home was louder than any words I could have said. You once told me that love means protecting someone even when they don't understand why. That's what I tried to do. I hope one day you can forgive me for the way I did it. If this letter ever reaches you, I want you to know you were my only love, Michael. Always. Even when I let you believe I had betrayed you, my heart never once belonged to anyone else. Love doesn't die, even when trust does. I just wish I had more time to tell you that in person. Yours always, Sarah. By the time Michael finished reading, the paper was soaked, not by rain, but by his own tears. His breath came in slow, uneven gasps. Every word from her letter cut through the years of bitterness like light breaking through storm clouds. He leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing. The sound of the rain seemed softer now, like a voice whispering forgiveness through the night. For hours, he sat there in silence. Memories returned, Sarah's laughter echoing in the hallway, her habit of talking to plants in the garden, the way she always touched his shoulder when walking past him, small gestures he once took for granted. He realized how much of his life had been shaped not by truth, but by what he thought was the truth. When dawn finally came, he stepped outside. The air was fresh, heavy with the scent of wet earth. The sea was calm again, as if the storm had been only a test, and he had finally survived it. He stood on the porch, the letter pressed to his chest, and whispered, I'm sorry too, Sarah. Months later, Michael sold the house by the coast. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he finally could let go. He donated most of what he owned, kept only Sarah's letter, and began volunteering at a local shelter for families in crisis, helping others who had lost trust, love, or direction. He never remarried. He didn't need to. Some love stories don't end in reunion. They end in understanding. And Michael understood, at last, the cruel but simple truth about betrayal. Sometimes, what looks like infidelity is really sacrifice. But lies, even the noble kind, still destroy what they aim to protect. Love cannot survive without truth. And yet, where there is love, forgiveness always follows.